good morning and welcome everyone. Hopefully you're all here for the second Modern Slavery webinar in conjunction with the Anti-Slavery Week, accumulating on the Friday Anti-Slavery Day. My name's Jason Grove. I'm going to just do the basic introductions today for the webinar, and then I'm going to hand over to your speaker, Superintendent Nick Walton. So thank you everyone for calling in. Some of you as well may be repeat callers from yesterday's first webinar. Thank you to Public Health England for hosting again on their IT webinar platform. So yesterday we had the first webinar that just set the scene around the basic signs and indicators of modern slavery, which was presented by Sergeant Dan Parkinson from the Modern Slavery Police Transformation Team. What we're going to go on through towards the end of the week is giving some more specific and detailed seminars. So today we've kindly got, like I said, Superintendent Nick Walton, who's going to give you some more input around how modern slavery and the wider criminality around this exploitation can occur. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Nick. But before I just forget though, if I could ask people if there's any questions, if you could make a note of those and send those through, and Nicola will pick those up on the webinar and we'll address those at the end. And equally, there's a poll just with two basic questions for feedback as well. If you could look to complete those before you sign off the webinar at the very end as well. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everyone. I am Nick Walton. I'm Superintendent within West Midlands Police. I work within a Public Protection Department, and one of my strategic responsibilities is around the West Midlands Police and broader partnership response to slavery and human trafficking. What I'm going to try and do this morning is just give you a brief overview of how trafficking has evolved within the West Midlands Police, some of the links that we're now seeing to other forms of exploitation, some successes within the West Midlands Police area, some of the data around increasing levels of reporting, and where I anticipate the direction of travel going over the next 12 months to 18 months, together with some of the real challenges that we as a police service and also as a broader partnership are facing in dealing with the issue. So without further ado, I just want to take you to slide 2, which effectively is the Liberate banner. The only reason I'll do that is just that over time you may see that either within documentation that's issued across the 7 local authority areas or alternatively across social media. Effectively, Liberate is the banner under which all the activity that we've undertaken over the last 3 to 4 years within the West Midlands Police Force area is undertaken, and it's just to ensure that whether it be enforcement, whether it be prevent work, is understood by the broader community and by partners under that header. So if I may, I'll just touch on the Modern Slavery Act, which I think is quite important in terms of the links around slavery, trafficking and other forms of exploitation. So the Modern Slavery Act came into play in 2015. Really helpful piece of legislation in the sense that it consolidated other bits of statute which were quite complicated in real terms in terms of law enforcement being able to prosecute offences of slavery and trafficking. So it consolidated legislation, made clearer the definitions around slavery and trafficking, but also enhanced the sentencing provision. So theoretically now, if convicted of one of these offences, offenders could face a sentence of up to life imprisonment. As it stands currently within the UK, we haven't seen that, but I do think it is only a matter of time before we get to that position, which I think will act as a really helpful deterrent to exploiters. The legislation also really helpfully brings in aspects that enable the police to prevent offences of slavery and trafficking. So some of that happens pre-charge or pre-conviction around trafficking risk orders, but we also have the opportunity through the court process to implement trafficking prevention orders, which again were brought into play through this piece of legislation. There is a real recognition, I think, that slavery and trafficking is serious and organised crime, and again, helpfully the legislation enables us now to seek assets from those that exploit people within this space. Again, something that wasn't potentially available prior to the introduction of the 2015 Act. And interestingly and fairly uniquely, the legislation also introduces the concept of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. There's a recent appointment to that role, Dame Sarah Thornton, who's an ex-Chief Constable, who's now in post and has the role of advising government, and I think helpfully challenging policing and the broader partnership around our response to the crime. And then two interesting bits of legislation, or parts of the legislation, are Section 45, which again is fairly unique in legal terms, in the sense that this provides a defence to certain victims of trafficking if they then go on to commit criminal offences. So for instance, shoplifting or other such offences, if they've undertaken those offences as a consequence of coercion or threat, having been trafficked, there is a defence available in law to that offence. Now, I think there is a recognition within policing that we're not quite there yet in terms of understanding the context of Section 45, and we are working really hard with the Crown Prosecution Service to get better at our response to victims who potentially come into our custody environments having committed criminal offences, but having committed those offences as a consequence of their exploitation. So we are working with the CPS to get better around this, but we're also working with partners such as the Children's Society, who shortly will be doing some work with us within our custody environments to raise awareness. And then Section 54, finally, of the Act, which enables government to put some demands on industry around supply chains, and that's effectively around organisations who have a turnover in excess of 36 million and the requirements to them to have measures in place to address potential exploitation within their supply chains. Again, lots of work going on nationally to try and make that part of the legislation more robust. And again, just finally around the Act, it is now subject to a review, so we anticipate that we will see subtle amendments moving forward. But again, I have to say, a really helpful piece of legislation. So briefly to the definition. So slavery, you'll see in front of you. What is key, I think, around this is the notion that the offender should know or ought to know that what they do is exploitative. And the fact that a victim consents to any element of the exploitation does not negate the offence. And I think that's probably the only thing really worthy of mention in that. But if you wanted to, certainly the legislation is available on open source to have a more in-depth look at the legislation and the terminology aligned to slavery. And then secondly, around trafficking. And I think this is the important bit really when we talk about wider criminality. So if you look at the definition of trafficking, it is no more than movement from A to B with a view to, and I say a view to rather than necessarily substantive exploitation, but with a view to exploiting a human being. Now that's where the relevance around crimes such as child sexual exploitation and county lines have a relevance, because if you look at both of those issues, effectively they will involve on occasions a degree of movement with a view to exploiting and can be indeed prosecuted under the Modern Slavery Act. Interestingly, again, around trafficking with UK nationals, if a UK national traffics an individual outside of the UK, they can be held to account under the Modern Slavery Act. But non-UK nationals are only held responsible for trafficking into the UK or within the UK. So I'm just going to touch upon county lines. So hopefully many of you will have heard of county lines. You'll have seen it within the media. Lots of conversation at governmental level. I have to say, and this is a personal view, rather unhelpful in a term in the sense that it isn't a crime in itself. County lines doesn't exist anywhere within statutes, but it is effectively the exploitation of children or vulnerable adults within the drugs market. There is a belief certainly that a lot of this activity takes place in urban areas with individuals being exploited in less urban areas, more rural areas, so effectively children and potentially vulnerable adults being transported out of Birmingham, for instance, and then committing criminal offences in other less urban areas. The issue around this is, I should say, quite unhelpful, because I do believe we have this type of exploitation happening within some of our city areas. It's just that the terminology very much applies to the phone line and applies to that particular methodology where we're exporting people into more rural areas. Again, I think unhelpfully there are national agendas around this, but I think over time what we will see is agendas starting to merge around county lines, CSE and slavery and trafficking, purely in the sense that if we were to look at all of those definitions, they are all ostensibly the exploitation of human beings, and it makes no sense to deal with them in isolation. So just some of the statistics, and this is over a 12-month time frame. This is what we're seeing within West Midlands Police. So This will take into account elements of CSE. It will take into account elements of county lines. So if we go left to right, if you look at the sexual exploitation narrative, the highest bar there is around UK nationals. That might appear surprising on face value. The reality is the lion's share of those individuals will be children under the age of 18 who've been subject to child sexual exploitation and have been captured in that cohort as a consequence. What you then see by way of demographic is Albanian nationals, and what we quite often see is Albanian sex workers trafficked into the UK and then exploited therein. And then we have a mixed demographic thereafter, which you are free to look at in your leisure. This is very much reflective of the national position, so there's nothing that I'm telling you here that is different from a West Midlands perspective. If you look at criminal exploitation, again, where we look at UK nationals, the lion's share of those UK nationals will be subject to county lines exploitation. Where we then see Vietnamese, the likelihood is that was in a nail bar setting or potentially a cannabis grow setting, more so actually than the nail bar, which is more likely to feature within labour exploitation. And then again, Albanian nationals feature quite highly, but as I say, very much reflective of what we see nationally. And then the third one, which I'll touch upon, is that of labour exploitation. And again, if you look at the demographic split, we've seen certainly within the West Midlands area a high percentage of Polish nationals exploited within the labour space, within a variety of different industries, whether that be food processing, packaging, the construction industry. Again, very much reflective of what we see nationally. And then just latterly, we'll see the classification around domestic servitude, which is very, very well hidden, I would suggest, and not something that we're identifying readily. So I think an area that we really need to focus on moving forward with partner agencies to understand those individuals who may potentially be subject to exploitation within the area of domestic servitude. So if I may, just to touch upon how we've evolved the partnership model in response to slavery trafficking, and I think even more so now and more currently around CSE and county lines, and how I think that will evolve over the next 18 months. So from a slavery and trafficking point of view, we have now a strategic partnership, a board that meets on a quarterly basis that I chair. It's attended by a range of different agencies, but is represented importantly by each of the 7 local authorities across the West Midlands area. And the charge of that group is to effectively ensure that activity within those local authority areas is very much delivered in line with the counter-terrorism model, which is the 4P model. So ensuring that staff are trained, they're aware of the issue regardless of agency. But more importantly, I think now moving forward, that there is a potentially tactical response to what we may see as on occasion low level of intelligence that doesn't necessarily automatically need a policing response, but would benefit from other agencies such as the local authority, the environmental agency, having a look at a particular scenario to see whether, one, we've got slavery or trafficking, or if we haven't clearly got slavery or trafficking, on occasions we may have other forms of exploitation, such as staff working below the minimum wage. Sat beneath the partnership, we have the West Midlands Anti-Slavery Network, a really key partner for us, been in play for a number of years now. A gentleman by the name of Robin Briley, who's the chair of that group, may be known to some of you, do lots of work both with the police but with other agencies in terms of really driving forward this agenda. And then more broadly supported by the Panel for the Protection of Trafficked Children, which is chaired by Bernardo's, again supported by the local authority structures and commissioned by the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner. And then importantly, over the last certainly 12 months, we've started to see a developing framework within the local authority areas. And for me, this is really key because, as I say, we cannot enforce our way out of this issue. We cannot arrest our way out of this issue. We need local authority partners, and when I say local authority partners, that is not just the local authority. That will be other agencies such as DWP, HMRC, the Gangmaster, Labour Abuse Authority, to all work collaboratively in raising awareness, identifying the signs, and potentially affecting activity or disruption to try and get us to a better place around slavery and trafficking. And these are evolving now at pace. And certainly I'm going to touch upon at the next slide the Sandwell model, which is arguably the best model that we've currently got within the West Midlands, a really robust model and one that has been reflected as other local authority areas start to develop their approach. And indeed, worthy of mention, Sandwell is now up for national recognition around their response to the crime type. And then finally, and more recently, and this is where we see the overlap with county lines and CSE, we are starting to see a developing platform around child exploitation. So historically, multi-agency safeguarding hubs within the local authority areas have responded very much to the more traditional types of child abuse, whether that be interfamilial or not. But now there's a broadening mindset around children who are exploited, whether it be in a criminal space or more broadly within a CSE setting. So we're now starting to see within the 7 local authority areas differing models, albeit pleasingly models that are starting to talk about a broader cohort of children, are working again with partners, looking at models around prevent. And this is where naturally you will see, I think, a synergy between adult slavery and trafficking, child slavery and trafficking, county lines and CSC. We're not quite there yet, but I think it's an inevitability that we'll start to see a slightly different structure moving forward. So if I may, I'll just touch briefly upon the Sandwell model that I've alluded to. Again, look at this at your leisure. It just shows the structure and the way Sandwell are engaged with various strategic boards within the local authority. But the most important board for me is the board that is in the middle of the page. It's a meeting, a virtual meeting, effectively called the Slavery and Human Trafficking Operational Partnership, the SHOP. And this, as I say, gives a platform for the local authority through their dedicated coordinator, Wendy Sims, but also through a sergeant and an inspector, Colin Gallier, who are their police leads, to pick up low-level intelligence that's not clearly slavery or trafficking, and to be able to deliver a prompt and effective response to that issue. So it might be, by way of example, a brothel where it's not clear trafficking, but there would be some benefit in trying to understand a little bit more around that brothel and the potential that individuals at that location may be exploited. And again, that particular virtual body of people can deliver an operational response to that. And as a consequence, what we do see is a fairly rich picture of intelligence within the Sandwell local authority area. And pleasingly for me, as the chair of the strategic board now, other partners across the other local authority areas are starting to look at Sandwell to see how they can develop their response in line with that. So moving forward, some successes. So I think if you'd have asked me, as somebody who's worked in this space now for about 4 years, my greatest frustration was our inability to hold offenders to account and to bring people to justice. And there are some reasons for that that I'll touch on towards the end of the presentation. But a really notable success, which was flagged on Panorama within the last month, I think you can still access this should you wish, but was around Operation Fort, which is a long-standing trafficking investigation around Polish nationals, an interfamilial organised crime group who effectively conned, for want of a better term, Polish vulnerable nationals in coming over to the UK, primarily accommodated them within the western side of the force, so that's the Black Country area, Sandwell, Walsall and so on, and then effectively took their identities, opened bank accounts in their names, committed fraud, but also exploited those individuals within the agricultural industry. A really compelling story, and one that has been helpful, if traumatic, in raising the profile of slavery and trafficking. And again, I know certainly the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, who I alluded to earlier, is using this as an example of where we need to get better, because it's quite abhorrent to feel that, you know, grown men effectively on that Panorama documentary were in tears as a consequence of their exploitation. So I would genuinely encourage you to watch that to see the impact that this crime can have. And that was very much within the labour, exploitation, modern slavery field. Moving forward, it's a case that I just want to touch upon around county lines. So this is a young lad by the name of Zachariah Mohammed, who was convicted latter end of 2018 to 14 years imprisonment. Effectively, his method of operating was by way of a phone line. So he would operate a phone line and effectively offer up to deliver drugs from the Birmingham area into Lincolnshire. So the phone line, as I referred to earlier, is very much the county line. He exploited 2 teenage boys and a young teenage girl and effectively used a method that we know as cuckooing. So took over a vulnerable person's house within Lincolnshire in order to supply drugs to the local market. Now, the belief is that this type of activity is taking place very much because of the concentration and saturation of drugs within Birmingham and other big city areas. So by way of a lack of competition, some individuals will take it upon themselves to migrate outside of these urban areas into the more rural areas, and this is exactly what Mr. Mohammed did. Fortunately, through some intelligence and close working with Lincolnshire, a fairly extensive police operation was instigated, people were rescued, and fortunately, as I say, the Modern Slavery Act was utilised in this case, and it was the first case that the Modern Slavery Act was instigated and utilised around county lines to prosecute this individual. So again, a really pleasing outcome. And the gent on the left is Superintendent Rich Agar, who is currently our thematic lead for slavery and trafficking. And then finally, and very recently again, attracted lots of press interest with officers appearing on the Victoria Derbyshire show on Friday of last week. Was a gentleman by the name of Ionescu, who effectively trafficked a Romanian female who was 3 months pregnant into the UK under the guise that she would be undertaking work as a masseur, but then quickly put her into a scenario where effectively she was living in a brothel, forced to dress inappropriately, and was advertised on adult services platforms for sex work alongside other no doubt trafficked sex workers with various addiction issues. A taxi driver, is the gent on the right, will be commended really for his actions in the sense of having been asked to drop the victim to a certain location, recognised the signs and contacted the police, and she was rescued. Unfortunately, activity was undertaken by the police at the brothel location, and none of the other victims would provide an account to enable their recovery or rescue. That said, the gent has been convicted at court in his absence, and efforts are now being made to locate him. But again, high profile case, both regionally and nationally, so really positive story. So briefly, just the national narrative, as I've already alluded to really, we currently have a silo mentality around CSE, slavery, trafficking and county lines. I think over time that will degrade, and indeed at a national conference 2 weeks ago, the Chief Constable Simon Bailey from Norfolk launched an event where we are now starting to talk about exploitation as we start to encourage new ways of working, both within law enforcement but across the broader partnership. And exploitation, as I say, I think is just the word that we will all start to become more conversant with as we move forward, regardless of the legislation under which we prosecute offenders. And then finally, really, so in terms of the challenges for law enforcement and partners, this is really complex stuff. We are dealing with, as we are with CSE and potentially with county lines, victims that are damaged potentially, who do not have the confidence to engage with law enforcement, who may have an alternative want, which is no more than repatriation if they're foreign nationals. So we need to get more sophisticated in how we challenge exploiters and how we try to disrupt their activity, because to be solely dependent upon a victim is really quite difficult for us. And again, with austerity, this is a new demand, or certainly an emerging demand, and one that at the moment law enforcement and partners are struggling to cope with. You know, year on year, exponentially, we're seeing growth in this area, which is positive. But hopefully, as we turn the corner with austerity, any investment within policing and other agencies will enable us to focus on this area in a far more robust way. And then, as I've alluded to, not unique to the West Midlands, national position around low charge rates and low conviction rates. So accepting the 3 cases I've just shown you are unique to a degree within the UK. You know, the largest labour case, the first use of the modern slavery case around county lines, and our first case of sexual exploitation. You know, there is a volume that we still need to get to the point of charging offenders. And then the final challenge, as always, which is why we're here today, is around that awareness raising. So we're doing everything we can, both as a single agency and with partners to improve our investigative response, to train our staff, both in terms of investigation but also in terms of recognising the signs. And then similarly externally, which is the work that we're trying to drive forward through the strategic board and the various siloed bits of work that currently take place around county lines and CSE. Pleasingly, I think the collaboration is there around trying to get us to that position where we can simplify for staff and for frontline practitioners the signs of trafficking and slavery, whether that be CSE or whether it be county lines or the more traditional view of slavery and trafficking, and then having recognised the signs, what to do. Thank you. So that concludes the presentation, and I believe now happy to take questions.